Test? Test? Okay. Nobody has to be born. None of us has to be here, really, did we? No matter the color of our skin, where we live, east, west, north, south, we're all in the same predicament. You might put it this way: we've all got birthday suits. Or as I like to say, often ask, well, do you have skin? That realization is a great equalizer, I think. So related to that, I want to talk this morning about compassion as a basis for ethics. Ethics, moral behavior, right and wrong. What are the codes of conduct we use, or the rules of behavior that we go by, and where do they come from? I have to credit this book right here, Beyond Religion, Ethics for a Whole New World, for help in coming up with that understanding. It's by Tenzin Gyatso, who's also known as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, spiritual leader of the Tibet people. That's his biography that I read there basically, but he frames it around compassion. Where did he get compassion from? And what is it? And it has something to do with, human mind. So I read half of this quite a number of years ago, and I, pretty much got the gist of what I thought was important. And but then I just recently checked it out, read the whole thing. Okay, so I'll be back in the library tomorrow or the next day if you want to look into it at the library. But before I get into that approach to ethics, I want to back up and say, there's a couple of approaches. Maybe there's more than that. I'm thinking of maybe two basic approaches. One is a theistic approach, and the one I'm thinking of based around compassion is a non-theistic approach. So the theistic approach, I'd say that's probably the most common approach in the Western world based on the Judeo-Christian tradition. Some would say that in order to have truth in ethics, you have to have a deity who establishes law and order. Okay? Ethics, by decree, if you wish, handed down by a deity. I'm thinking of Exodus and the Ten Commandments, handed down by a deity who is jealous. Okay? And we know that from those 10 commandments, there's that one verse that I find problematic where this God is jealous, and if you don't buy into at least those first 3 commandments, that there's that statement that you'll be punished, and not only you, but your children of the 3rd and 4th generation. So I find that problematical. And in our, UU tradition, I think that Universalists walked away from that many years ago, walked away from a punishing deity. And another issue I have with the theistic approach, and I think this is probably for me the greatest one, is you run into that problem of theodicy. That's kind of a traditional branch of theology, Western theology, where you're trying to justify the ways of a deity. And especially, you run into this problem when you're thinking about some of the horrendous human evil and atrocities that humans are capable of. I'm thinking of the Holocaust and ethnic cleansings and other such things. Murray Harr, I think he's probably retired now. He was a professor at Augustana College in the religion department. He is Jewish. But he would say this. He said, unless your theology plays at Auschwitz, I don't want to talk about it. Another Jewish person, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, said this: no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. So the issue is, how do you explain the ways? Usually the deistic approach, the deity is ascribed either all power, or is all powerful, or all knowing, or all loving, or some combination of those three. And then so how do you explain things like that happen? How could a deity allow this to happen in the world? And that seems to me kind of messed up if you have to try to explain the ways of God and justify the ways of a deity. And so that didn't work too good for me as a basis for ethics. So I've come to a way, and thanks to this, reading this book, to think about ethics non-theistically, which is more from the bottom up, from the natural earth, from the natural human condition in which we are born, our shared human condition. Nobody asked to be born. The Dalai Lama in this book, he writes, "I do not agree that ethics requires grounding in religious concepts or faith. Instead, I firmly believe that ethics can also emerge simply as a natural and rational response to our very humanity and our common human condition." Okay, so in Buddhism, there's no concept of sin. There's this idea of karma, cause and effect. If you do this, then this happens. And I'm not talking about reincarnation type of karma, okay? I'm just talking about the basic, how the world works. That's what karma is. I'm here because of a whole series of decisions that I made down through my life. It's a feature of the universe. It's just the way the universe acts. And according to that, if we do a benefit to others and compassion, and then that's going to have consequences, hopefully good consequences. And if we do a benefit of others, that's also going to be a benefit for us. Not necessarily in the fact that we'll eventually get something, but it just helps us in being a true human being the way we're supposed to be, as giving and kind creatures. And so compassion is like karma as part of that. It's just part of the natural way things are. Okay? If we do harm to someone else, we might also suffer. Okay? The Dalai Lama in the book here also says, likewise, we are born free of religion, but we are not born free of the need for compassion. Okay, so let's talk some more about compassion. What do we mean? What is it I'm talking about with this kind of compassion? So first of all, I looked up the word in my Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, 1973 edition. It's the first book I bought when I went to college. Okay, you can't find a definition for selfie in it. But it's still good, basically. So I looked it up, and compassion, of course, the Latin root calm, meaning with or together, and then passion is based on a Latin root that means to suffer. And so this is the definition it gives. It's a noun. Sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Okay, that's from the dictionary. I think the idea of compassion that I'm talking about doesn't jump immediately to someone else's distress. Okay, it starts elsewhere, and I want to read or talk about that. Pema Chodron is a Buddhist nun in the same tradition, the Buddhist tradition, as the Dalai Lama. And she has this to say about compassion, and I'm loosely paraphrasing from a videotaped lecture that I watched or listened to. She says there's a lot of misunderstanding about compassion. We think of it as something kind of idealistic and mushy and maybe sentimental. Maybe you think of a Hallmark card when you think about compassion. But she says what compassion is really about is our relationship with pain and suffering. And before we jump to the conclusion that it's about the pain and suffering of others primarily, she says, quote, "We learn true compassion as we begin to have a more open-hearted and open-minded relationship with our own pain." Our own pain. How comfortable are we with our own pain? Do we understand it? Or are we running from it? Trying to cover it up, trying to hide it? Are we able to get in touch with it and feel it and have a conversation with it and articulate it? That's where compassion starts. And then from there, we could move out to others, as the quote on the cover of the bulletin that I had put there by Pema Chodron has it. Compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It is a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. I want to share something from my own life back when I was going to seminary at Luther Seminary. I had a chance during one winter break about this time of year, I think it was probably right between Christmas and New Year's, I got to fill in for someone at an insulation company. They were going on a vacation and I got to fill in for them. Well, I had to travel from where I lived right there on the edge of St. Paul, on the western edge of St. Paul, to somewhere in southern Minneapolis. And my wife had to have the car to get to work, so I plotted a route by bus, which involved 2 or 3 different changes of bus. I had to get out and wait for the bus. Well, it was cold. It was colder than it was here yesterday. I think the wind chills are down to -20 and -30. And I was very impressed in trying to navigate my way to this work site, where we had to start from, with the reality that this cold could kill me. I was dependent upon my clothing and the bus stop shelters and the alcoves in the stores where I could hide away from the wind chill. And I was dependent on the bus drivers who would pick me up, and the people who maintained the bus that kept the heater working. And I was at the same time impressed with the reality that everyone outside there was in the same situation. We all needed that whole family of people keeping the heat infrastructure going, or else we would perish in that cold. And I look back on that as an experience of compassion. And for me, it was kind of a numinous experience filled with spiritual meaning when I realized how vulnerable I was out there in that cold, and how everyone else was in the same situation. And so experiences like that can help us, and maybe some of you had similar experiences, get in touch with compassion, our basic human creatureliness. The fact that I have skin just like every other human being on this planet. The fact that I am subject to creaturely needs and subject to harm and sickness and death. And that's why I think that song by Peter Mayer that we listened to is really a realization that the first step, that nobody has to be born, is one of the first steps on the road to compassion. And then we begin, as we are able to have a more open-minded relationship with our own pain and suffering. And then from there we can move out to the pain and suffering of others. If I want to avoid pain and suffering and have some basic minimum of safety and comfort, then certainly others also want to have that same thing. And so this brings to mind, the golden rule. do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That rule is found in just about every religion around the world in some form or other. You know, I don't want to suffer, and neither does my neighbor want to suffer. Since we're all humans, we're all connected, okay? It's like whatever you do to others, you're really doing it back to yourself. Okay, so I went to seminary and I was a pastor for a while, but pastoral care was really never my forte, you know, going to see people in the hospital, talking to people and suffering. I was never very good at that or comfortable doing it. I'm maybe better now. But I do remember something that I learned at seminary that stuck with me. Advice from the seminary campus pastor, who Ellen may recall. I think his last name was Knutson. Anyway, he participated in some class that I had to take. And we were talking about the topic of pastoral care and the topic of, okay, how do you go to someone who is dying? You know, how do you relate to them? And he had this piece of advice that has stuck with me. He said, well, I think the attitude you have to go with when you are going to visit somebody who is dying is that you are one dying person going to talk and visit with another dying person. And that made sense with me. That stuck with me. Yes, we are all human, and dying is part of that. And so compassion is a recognition of that fact also. We're all going to die. The timing, circumstances will be different, but you know, it's like the doctor looked over our crib and said, every one of us, the case, it's terminal, okay? It's a terminal case. We're just lucky to be here today, and okay. All right, I got this cartoon in my files that I thought of when I was thinking about this topic, and I couldn't find it. It might be in a file at my other house. My daughter just moved out of it, so now we can go see what other junk we need to deal with in our life. But this cartoon pictures a cocktail party, and the people at this cocktail party look like they've all been, you know, in some kind of, they're all just came out of a clinic and they've all been treated with shrapnel wounds. They're all wrapped up with bandages, you know, every single one of them, there's got bandages all over their body, okay? And there's two people who are standing off to the side visiting, and this cartoon, one of the persons here, these two people are visiting, and they're talking about somebody over there, and one of the persons is saying, they're talking about another guest at this party, and this person is saying, you know, under that false exterior, she's a very wounded person. Well, they're all wounded people there. I guess that reminded me of somebody who was totally missing this compassion and the fact that they all were sharing a common condition of being wounded. And that brought up for me that saying, I thought of the saying, you maybe heard it in some form or another, that says, be kind. Everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. And I think this saying embodies that idea of compassion. We're all in this human thing together, so be kind. Sometimes these feelings of compassion can come spontaneously, and like maybe that experience I had that winter trying to deal with that cold. Pema Chodron in the book When Things Fall Apart writes about a woman who was dying and in terrible pain, and at a point when the woman felt she couldn't bear it any longer, she unexpectedly began to experience the pain of others in agony. A starving mother in this is, I quote, a starving mother in Ethiopia a runaway teenager dying of an overdose in a dirty flat, a man crushed by landslide and dying alone by the banks of a river. She said she understood that it wasn't her pain anymore. It was the pain of all beings. It wasn't just her life, it was life itself. And she continued to write, she says, "This tenderness for life, when we can no longer shield ourselves from the vulnerability of our condition, from our basic condition, from the basic fragility of existence, you take it all in. Let the pain of the world touch your heart, and you turn it into compassion." So sometimes these things, come about spontaneously, but sometimes we also need to use our human mind to try to develop them, our reason, our discernment. I'm not necessarily covering all of ethics, so there's many other difficult, thorny problems in the world, and we need to use our reasoning and our mind. The Dalai Lama talks about some of the other issues in ethics if you want to read the book. I think about what Reverend Gene Morrow talked about last week about integrity, and I thought, that is a further elaboration of ethics. We have integrity. We want to have integrity because, well, first of all, we've discovered compassion, and we realize that our actions in the world have consequences for ourselves and for others. So basically what compassion has to do with is our shared humanity, a realization that we are all the same, that we are also dependent on others. The Dalai Lama argues that this kind of approach to ethics has the potential to be universally accepted and requires only two basic principles. I quote, "The first principle is the recognition of our shared humanity and our shared aspirations to happiness and the avoidance of suffering. The second is the understanding of interdependence as a key feature of human reality, including our biological reality as social animals. From these two principles, we can learn to appreciate the inextricable connection between our own well-being and that of others, and we can develop a genuine concern for the well-being of others." Our common humanity. We are 100% the same, all 7+ billion of us on the planet. No such thing as separate races. We're all the same. And so I'd like to suggest that this fact that we all have skin, that none of us asked to be born, should be held up as the first and foremost of human spiritual principles. Something that can't be trumped by political claims, or religious claims, or doctrinal claims, or metaphysical claims. And if this was first and foremost in all people's minds and thoughts and motivations, that we would be on our way to a different world, I believe. A common humanity, east, west, north, south, humans the same. Well, the tie-in to our UU principles, I think it ties in, this idea of compassion ties into our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And I think in our current predicament, some have proposed that we say all beings. I could go along with that in our human predicament because we can no longer think of ourselves as separate from the natural world from which we evolved and which sustains us. We have to have a compassionate understanding of our connection to all beings. And I suppose maybe we could just say that this was all covered in the seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I don't think we can have a respect for the web of existence of which we are a part, or even realize that it is an interconnected web without this kind of understanding of compassion. What this kind of compassion makes us realize is how intimately tied up we are all with all beings and all of the non-sentient beings, with our whole universe, our solar system, our earth, our biosphere, and all of the life that is here. Okay? All of us, all creatures, everything is tied up in an intimate web of existence. And we no longer have the luxury to think of ourselves as separate from the universe, the planet, or the biosphere from whence we came. May we and all beings everywhere be filled with compassion. Thank you for your attention.